Good evening. For those of you who don't know, I'm Anne-Marie Lipinski. I'm the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard, and it is my great, great pleasure to welcome you all to the Walter Lippmann House tonight for the awarding of the Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Journalism. It's an award that dates back to 1967. The prize honors investigative reporting of national significance where the public interest is being ill-served. Judges for the award weigh the entries for some of journalism's very highest values. They include accuracy, clarity of analysis, the magnitude of the issues being investigated, and reforms that came in the wake of the stories. Through the generosity of the Bingham family and the Bingham board, the prize carries with it a $20,000 purse. The Bingham family is one of the most storied in American journalism, having dominated the media landscape in Louisville for decades with a powerful and crusading brand of journalism. Worth Bingham, a 1954 graduate of Harvard, embodied those values, working as a reporter in Minneapolis and San Francisco and Washington, and later on the executive staff of the family publishing company in Louisville. Following his tragic death at the age of 34, his family and friends created this award as a fitting tribute to his legacy and his great, great passion for this work. We are honored at the Nieman Foundation to be a partner in this prize. There are many, many worthy journalistic awards, of course, but the singular focus of the Worth Bingham Prize on investigative journalism is especially dear to my heart, having labored in those fields myself for many years as a reporter and an editor. And I value it not for romantic or nostalgic reasons, though maybe those too, but because it is a kind of journalism that is ever more in need while ever more in peril. It takes time, it takes money, it takes stomach, and it takes a skill and a perseverance that is not always rewarded or nurtured in the modern newsroom. So we applaud the opportunity to celebrate investigative journalism done well and to annually welcome the journalists doing this work to Harvard and the Nieman Foundation in order to advance this important conversation about its value. Our winner this year is Sam Dolnick of the New York Times, whose award-winning project called Unlocked Inside New Jersey's Halfway Houses was a 10-month investigation that revealed a correctional system overrun with gang activity, drug use, sexual abuse, lax security, and limited accountability for all of it. We will have the privilege a little later this evening of hearing directly from Sam about his work, but please join me now in welcoming him to Lippmann House. Sam, welcome. I would like to also express my gratitude to the judges for this year's Worth Bingham Prize. They were Nieman Fellow Chris Arnold, a Boston-based correspondent for National Public Radio. Another one of my Nieman Fellows, Suad McKennett, a German reporter and columnist who works for the New York Times, Der Spiegel, and German television. Maggie Mulvihill, co-director and senior investigative producer for the New England Center for Investigative Reporting and a 2005 Nieman Fellow. James Neff, investigations editor at the Seattle Times. Nieman Fellow Betsy O'Donovan, former editor for the Durham Herald-Sun, and Nieman Fellow Laura Wides-Munoz, Hispanic affairs writer for the Associated Press. Following our dinner, Chris will come to the podium to introduce Sam and tell us more about why the committee selected his work. And very importantly, I want to extend a warm and special welcome to Clara Bingham, Worth's daughter, herself a Harvard graduate and in the family tradition also a great, great journalist. Clara, among many accomplishments, has served as White House correspondent for Newsweek and the author of 2 books, Woman on the Hill, Challenging the Culture of Congress, and Class Action, the landmark case that changed sexual harassment law, later adapted into the film North Country, for which the actresses Charlize Theron and Frances McDormand received Oscar nominations. While reporting a story in West Virginia, Clara, a Kentucky native, witnessed the destructive effects of mountaintop removal, coal mining, inspiring her work producing the film The Last Mountain. She's also at work now in a very ambitious book documenting the anti-war movement during Vietnam. We are sorry that Clara's mother, Joan, cannot be with us tonight. She's always a welcome attendee at these dinners, but want to express our very deep appreciation for her and Clara's commitment to investigative journalism as evidenced by this award and this dinner tonight. So on behalf of Harvard and the Nieman Foundation, I extend our heartfelt gratitude and would like to invite Clara up to say a few words.
Thank you, Anne Marie. That was so nice of you. I'm so happy to be here and so honored to have this prize. It's almost hitting 50 years. We have that coming up in a few years. And the most amazing winners, I actually just interviewed Seymour Hersh about the My Lai story for the book I'm working on, and only later realized that he had won the prize in 1969 before he won the Pulitzer for that story. And actually, it was what he had to do, the kind of gumshoe reporting required to track down Lieutenant Calley, find him, get him to tell him his story, and then all the other a lot of other sources in that troop who, eventually really told him the hair-raising, terrible story of what happened to My Lai reminds me of what Sam did in New Jersey. And it's really the same kind of important reporting of digging, and computers can't be substitutes anymore at all, even regardless of how much they are helping investigative reporting. Nothing can substitute knocking on doors and getting people to trust you, and in Sam's case, interviewing 200 people, which is just phenomenal, especially as a solo practitioner in the field. So I'm just so thrilled for Sam, and also for the Sulzberger family, which you might not know, but he is a member of it, which makes me even more proud, because it's always nice when kids end up respecting what their families do, especially if it's trying to run a newspaper, which these days, as we know, is a really tough thing. And the New York Times has persevered and is still funding investigative journalism and putting out amazing series on so many different subjects. And while the Courier Journal, which we sold to Gannett in 1986, is just a leaflet. I mean, it really doesn't have very much investigative journalism at all. They've closed their bureaus in Eastern Kentucky, and it's really a sad thing for the state of Kentucky. And as we all know, investigative journalism more than ever is so important for our democracy. I mean, it's just critical. And with newspapers dying right and left, it's exciting to know that there still are, investigative reporters like Sam and newspapers like the New York Times who are funding them to do work that we will hear more about tonight. So I just wanted to congratulate Sam and the New York Times and thank Anne Marie Lipinski and Bob Giles, who's also here, who shepherded our prize when we first started here 5 years ago. We used to be down in Washington. And Ellen Tuttle, who does a huge amount of the legwork to get this prize off the ground. There were 95 entries, and it was a huge amount of work for our 6 judges that I also want to thank. And it's a labor of love to have to read all of those entries, although it must have been a fascinating labor as well. So thanks for coming tonight, and I can't wait to hear more from Sam.
Thank you, Clara, and please enjoy dinner, and soon enough we'll hear from the winner. Thanks.
So in a minute we're going to bring Sam up. I've been enjoying having dinner next to Sam. But first, I'd like to say that this was not an easy award to judge. This award comes with a $20,000 prize. And as you might imagine, that means you get a lot of really, really good submissions. We had 100 really good submissions. There were 21 finalists. And I remember talking to Anne Marie at one point about this and saying I was maybe 2/3 of the way through digging through all these amazingly great pieces of investigative journalism and saying I was just befuddled. I'm like, how am I going to pick one? I mean, it seems crazy. It's a crazy enterprise. I mean, they're all good, you know. And then I read Sam's piece, and it was perfect. I mean, it just fit the criteria for this award, and it was such strong writing. And in selecting Sam's series for the Bingham Prize, the other judges and I praised Sam Dolnick's powerful writing, the depth and the scope of the investigation, and the ability of the series to spur meaningful reforms. I don't know if you had a chance to read the handout here, but Sam's series focused on what are called halfway houses in New Jersey, and the short definition, they're kind of like, they're less expensive prisons. So it costs like $150 a day to house a prisoner in a real prison. And it's like half that cost if you put them in a minimum security halfway house. And the thinking was, well, you know, if they're nonviolent offenders and they're getting ready to be paroled, why are we spending so much money? And with some of the cost savings, we can bring in education programs and job training and drug counseling and all this stuff. And so we can have better outcomes and reintroduce people to society. And we can save the taxpayer like half the money that they're spending on these prisoners instead of having them in jail. So that sounded really good. And there was a movement around the country to do this with these so-called halfway houses, and New Jersey was being held up as a model for a good way to do this. But Sam's stories uncovered a disturbing lack of security and oversight at these private quasi-jails, which is basically what they are. And it turns out that violent criminals were being placed in these halfway houses. That was not the original idea. And since 2006, the number of violent criminals has just about doubled. So things were changing in the wrong direction pretty quickly. There was also a startlingly high number of escapes. And this is one of the things as I was reading this that just jumped off the page to me. You figure, okay, sure, there's going to be some escapes, but since 2005, there were 5,000 escapes in the state of New Jersey from these quasi-jails, which was nuts. And Sam would go around to politicians who were responsible for oversight or for steering business towards these companies that do these kind of low security prisons. And I'll read a little bit from one of his stories. Assemblyman Charles Maynor, a Democrat and police detective who was chairman of the Law and Public Safety Committee, was asked for his estimate of how many people escaped from halfway houses in New Jersey in 2011. And he says, I have heard of no more than 3. According to state records, though, the number was 452, which is like, how can you not know that? How can you not know that dangerous criminals are going out, and they weren't just escaping and sort of getting jobs, quietly somewhere. They were like robbing liquor stores and hurting people and killing people. So it was like a serious problem that nobody seemed to be paying attention to. And Republicans and Democrats alike, another thing I liked about, and that we liked about it was, Sam Finn, it wasn't like a hit piece on the Republican governor, although there was an element with the Republican governor, but it was both sides were, not dealing with this. Assemblyman Sean Keane, a Republican, said of the escapes, it's not really a problem. It's a cheaper way of doing business, he said, of the system. So that's why it behooves us to use that option. So I guess that's one perspective. But Sam's stories, and the other thing that he showed that was going on is that the staff at these facilities were not trained. These were not prison guards. They didn't have sidearms. They didn't have any kind of self-protection. And you'd have 1 or 2 kind of like lower wage workers trying to supervise or discipline a couple hundred inmates in a very dangerous situation. And Sam's writing was very strong around, what would happen when the lights went out kind of thing. And the staff was scared to go near the dormitories where people were sleeping. So it was just bedlam. I mean, and people were getting, there was murder, there was, just a culture of terror. And the inmates themselves were asking to go back to prison, a lot of them, because it was just too crazy. And so Sam's stories pulled back the curtain, exposing this abuse and debunking the supposed success. I mean, again, this was being held up as a national model, and it was so terribly flawed. And we thought that was very cool to uncover something like that. The stories also found potential favoritism. This part has to do with the governor, involving the governor of New Jersey, Christie, and other state officials. And it turned out that a top executive of the company that runs most of these halfway houses in New Jersey, it's called Community Education, is that what it is? And a top executive at the company was Christie's senior political advisor. He chaired the inauguration committee, and Christie had actually lobbied on behalf of the company when he was a lawyer prior to becoming governor. So, I mean, this was a very politically connected company that had all kinds of problems. After the stories ran, the senior executive I just talked about resigned from the company. Governor Christie announced stepped-up monitoring of the halfway houses, and lawmakers in New Jersey introduced 6, 7, 8 different pieces of legislation that would require a bunch of different reforms. So for all those reasons, it just, we thought this was an incredible work of journalism. And before bringing Sam up here, we should talk about his background, although since he's only 23 years old. Now, he's 32 years old. And in 2002, we only have to go back that far to Sam's beginnings in journalism. He worked as a reporter at the Staten Island Advance. So I'm sure. From Staten Island or not. Yeah. And then he joined the Associated Press in New York. In 2007, he moved to New Delhi as an AP foreign correspondent, and then went on to work on the Metro desk at the New York Times. And recently, Sam has become a sports editor at the New York Times, which, unfortunately, you won't be editing more stories about the Celtics because we just bombed out of the playoffs. But at this point, too, I would like to thank Clara Bingham for joining us here tonight, and also to personally thank you for your family's commitment to this kind of reporting. As Anne-Marie said, I mean, we all know about the business model for many, many news organizations, and at a time when so many news organizations are having to make really tough decisions about how do they expend resources, I think awards like this underline the importance of the kind of quality investigative journalism that is so essential to a well-functioning democracy, journalism that can hold powerful people and institutions accountable, journalism that can change the world and make it a better place. So thank you, Clara, and congratulations, Sam.
Figure out how to turn off that.
First, now we do that.
Wait, so we're now going to present you. Yeah, this is normal.
Great.
So we have 2 things here. The first one is the check.
Put that in your pocket. Hand that over to my wife.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is your. You can frame it and put
Absolutely,
it in your
that's
office.
incredibly
It's
exciting.
your certificate.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. My chair. Well, thank you. Geez, thank you, Clara and Anne-Marie and the Nieman judges. And this is unbelievably exciting for me. I'm thrilled to be here. A year ago, when I was dialing wrong numbers and loitering outside halfway houses, it would have been really hard to picture myself standing here tonight. I've spent most of the past 2 years thinking about halfway houses, of all things. But when I began this reporting, I knew nothing. I couldn't have told you anything about the industry. I thought a halfway house, if I thought of them at all, was a rundown clapboard job on the edge of town where a dozen men dried out. They must have been run by local do-gooders or maybe the county. I don't know. But it turns out, of course, that halfway houses may have been like that once upon a time. But they're not like that anymore, especially in New Jersey. So I want to talk a little bit about my reporting into halfway houses, how I got on this story, and hopefully about investigative reporting, which you've heard the importance of tonight. And I, couldn't agree more and want to underline 1,000 times. This work is rare and it's hard and expensive, but it's crucially important. It's also lonely. investigative reporting. It's hard. I spent 10 months doing this. Felt at times, it's 10 months in a deep, dark cave looking for answers. You're not looking for a way out. You spend most of your time talking to people who don't want to talk to you, doubting yourself, contemplating careers far from journalism. My plan was to run off and become a bicycle mechanic, in fact. I want to thank Heidi, my wife here, who kept me sane during all that time. Heidi is a recovering journalist, and her support and guidance through all this was completely crucial. So thank you. Thank you. But in this reporting, there are breakthroughs. You have them, and they are bright, sunny days worth celebrating. So I want to revel in a few of those and tell you how this project kind of came together. When I began this reporting, I wasn't an investigative reporter. I'd never done this kind of work before. I was a beat reporter covering immigration issues. So I mostly wrote about immigrants' lives in New York, but I wrote some about detention and policy. And there was an immigrant detainee contract up for bid in New Jersey. It was one of the biggest in the country. Hundreds of immigrants, millions of dollars. And I decided to poke around. And when I started looking into it, it became clear pretty quickly that one company had the inside track. And it was this company with the great Orwellian name, Community Education Centers. And they'd been a major campaign contributor to local politicians. Their senior vice president was Governor Christie's closest friend in the world. And it looked like this bid for these immigrant detainees had been tailor-made for their largest facility in Newark. And they were confident they were going to win this bid. Months before submissions were due, they'd already gone on a hiring spree for people to take care of these new immigrants, which were on their way to their new facility. So I wrote a front page story about how this company had the inside track. And I thought I was done. Mission accomplished. On to the next story. But there was something still nagging at me and my editors. While I was writing that story, I tried to describe what this company did mostly, because immigrants was just kind of a sideline. And what they did was run industrial-sized halfway houses, more than 1,000 beds, and they ran them for profit. So this was an industry that none of us even knew existed before, which is kind of intriguing. And it's a cousin of the private prison industry, which made it kind of doubly intriguing to us. So I started learning as much as I could. I was cleared from my immigration responsibilities and given the room to dig in and kind of give myself a crash course in halfway houses. And just that opportunity to dig in deep was thrilling to me. As Chris said, I started out at the Staten Island Advance, working nights. I covered PTA meetings and speed bump installations, literally. And during that time, I kept a newspaper story pinned to my bulletin board at home. And the headline read, "For Mentally Ill, Death and Misery." And maybe not what most people keep in their bedroom, but I did. It was a searing investigation into New York's adult homes that uncovered hundreds of unreported deaths. And this was the kind of work I wanted to do. And I kept it on my bulletin board as inspiration. So that article was written by Clifford J. Levy, a New York Times reporter, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for it. And many years later, after he'd won another Pulitzer for investigative reporting in Russia, he came back to New York. It was announced that he was going to be an editor. And within minutes of that email going out, I was fighting to work with him. And he indeed became my editor on this series and was a crucial ally and guide throughout all of it. So I want to thank Cliff from up here. I'm sorry he couldn't be here. And I want to remind him that he never won the Worth Bingham Prize. Now, as I was starting, he and Carolyn Ryan, who's the Metro editor, had lots of experience with these kinds of projects. And they laid out what I needed to do to make this work. So you need personal stories to make the statistics come alive. You need sympathetic characters who the readers will connect with. You need data, statistics to be fully digested so that you can write with authority in every sentence. And you need primary documents that no one has ever seen before. And you need to get everything on the record. Right. So where's that bicycle mechanic shop? Okay. Adding to my burdens in those early days was the fact that these halfway houses didn't seem especially broken. These weren't Abu Ghraibs where everybody knows terror is lurking inside. These were held up as wonderful places, models for the rest of the nation. The industry had a great line to state governments. Send us your inmates, they said. We can house them for cheaper than you can. We'll rehabilitate them. And not only that, when they get out, they'll get jobs. They'll stay away from crime. They'll start paying taxes. It's a win-win-win. The sales pitch was so good that most government officials didn't want to know anymore. New Jersey especially. New Jersey had been a pioneer in this industry going back 20 years. They'd spent hundreds of millions of dollars sending tens of thousands of inmates through these places. But they'd never studied whether people who'd been to halfway houses were more or less likely to go back to prison. They had just been writing checks and hoping for the best. So it became clear before long that this had the potential for a good story. There were vulnerable people being outsourced to private companies. There were political connections, and there's very little oversight. And after 10 months of reporting, the systemic dysfunction was stark. The for-profit companies wanted to run these places as cheaply as possible, so they hired minimum wage workers who received virtually no training to keep these overcrowded buildings safe. Gang violence, contraband, drugs, all there. Rehab was shoddy. Records were forged. Classes were mostly untrained workers reading self-help lit in front of 300 rowdy inmates. In at least one case, gang members had been using the rehab classes to conduct gang business inside the halfway house. But all that took months to uncover. At the beginning, all we knew was that something didn't seem right. And that became clear as soon as you start reading old news clips. A staple of New Jersey newspapers has long been the escape brief. It's a short crime blotter story, 100 words, about a halfway house inmate who escaped. That's all. But it happens again and again and again. And that realization that escapes were a serious problem led to one of the early breakthroughs. But it was something that was hiding in plain sight all along, in some ways. So what we did was we submitted an open records request to the state government, asking them for the list of all the names of inmates who had escaped going back to 2005. Amazingly to us, the state said that no such list existed. It would be impossible to go back through all of the paper records and compile all the names of everybody who escaped. Sorry, we can't help. So we filed more requests to other agencies and went back to the governor's office and more requests. And finally, they did supply the information. More than 5,000 halfway house inmates had escaped since 2005. Hundreds and hundreds every single year. So with those names, we created a database that showed what they were convicted of, where they escaped from, and then how long they stayed on the run. And we cross-checked that with courthouse records and arrest reports to see how many of those fugitives had committed new crimes while they were on the loose. So slowly through this reporting, a portrait began to emerge of this system that was entirely porous, where escapes had no consequence. We spoke to current and former corrections officials who described the hamster wheel of life on the fugitive squad. There were always dozens of halfway house escapees to track down, new ones every single day. One former detective told me about catching a fugitive, bringing him back to the halfway house, and then within 2 weeks, catching the same guy again. Another said that his bosses had told him to ease up on the halfway houses, to soft pedal the paperwork, stop with all these reports about contraband and dysfunction. We zeroed in on fugitives who had committed crimes while on the run. And there were many of them. Most striking to us was the story of David Goodell. He was a small-time criminal with a history of abusive behavior. He escaped from a halfway house custody in 2010. And that same night, he met up with and murdered his 21-year-old ex-girlfriend, Viviana Tully. I tracked down her sister, Stella, and we arranged to meet at the New Jersey hospital where she worked. And we talked about her sister, how she was the baby of the family, how she followed Stella everywhere, and then how she met David Goodell. And I knew by the end of the lunch that this story of the Tooley family was the one to pin this theme of escapes to. So that first meeting with Stella was a key breakthrough for me. But we also wanted to learn what life was like inside these facilities for the people who didn't escape. And I went about this lots of ways. I went to halfway houses before dawn and parked my car outside the gate so I could approach the staffers who were going in, and even better, the inmates who were leaving for work programs. And a few of them signaled for me to follow them around the corner where they would be more free to talk. I spent time in some very dodgy sections of Newark. One guy wanted to meet in the back of a liquor store where he hung out in. But I found lots of inmates through him and through other contacts by being on the street in Newark day after day. But it was the workers who we found especially compelling. I spoke to one woman who was pumping gas at a Sunoco gas station before she took the halfway house job, which paid her less than Sunoco did. I spoke to another who was assigned the overnight shift. She was supposed to watch hundreds of men, pretty much on her own, but she was so scared that she locked herself in her office and refused to patrol the hallways at night. I spoke to lots of these workers. One led to another, but many were afraid to go on the record. So I convinced as many as I could to let me use their names, and we got many of them. All the ones we used were on the record in the end because we were unbending here, no anonymous sources. That made the reporting significantly harder, but it made it much, much stronger too. So it was during this line of reporting, while I was talking to these former halfway house workers, that I had perhaps my best day of all. So after many dead ends, I had tracked down the number of a former corrections officer who had worked at a halfway house. And she told me over the phone that she had quit in disgust over how poorly it was run. But she was reluctant to say more at first. She agreed to meet me at a Starbucks near her house, though. So she was waiting for me when I arrived the very next day. And she was in a business suit, very proper. And she had with her a stack of papers. My eyes kind of lit up. I was hoping that these would be the halfway house documents, which are more valuable than gold here. But she didn't hand them over right away. We talked first, and she wanted to know how much I knew, who I had been talking to, and what I was hoping to accomplish with these stories. And as we were talking, she began sharing wrenching stories from her time there, and she was just brimming with them. And finally, she started pulling out these papers and showing them to me. They were in chronological order, pristine, every memo, full rosters of the name of every staffer, every disciplinary sheet. Here, this was the dysfunction documented. And so this was invaluable, and in a sense broke the story open for me. All along, we'd wanted to tell a granular story about life inside a single halfway house, and now we were well on our way. She became one of my most important sources, and in a conversation many months later, I asked her why she had saved all these papers. And one, she was a pack rat. She opened up to it. But she also knew that something was wrong in this place where she worked, and she thought that these papers could play a role someday in helping to expose that. She'd never talked to a reporter before. She didn't really even quite understand how this might work, but she had a sense that she could do something. Before I met her, though, I'd been hearing for months about the midnight shift. It's when most of the staff went home and the rules went out the window. And I became fixed on the idea of describing what happens at the halfway house when the lights went out. In this box of documents was a complaint filed by a woman named Vanessa Falcone, who had been assigned to the halfway house for forging prescription medicine prescriptions. She wrote in longhand about the overnight shift. She described an overnight custodian who forced her into the closet and raped her. She eventually filed a complaint and was sent to another halfway house, but her case ended there. I had to talk to Vanessa Falcone. There were lots of people, actually, with her name in New Jersey. and I got a stack of phone numbers associated with all of them. So it's wrong number, disconnected phone, not at home, wrong number. But halfway down the list, several days later, a woman answered. I introduced myself and said I was with the New York Times, and she paused. I expected her to hang up as well, but she didn't. She said, "I know what you want to talk about, and I've been waiting so long for someone to call." That was an important day for me. Before I talk about just one last break I had in my reporting, I wanted to tell you a few of the big lessons that I learned, that I took away from this project. They won't be earth-shattering to anyone in this room, but they were key for me. The first, as we've said before, is that investigative reporting is difficult, painstaking, expensive. Editors have to grant reporters permission to hit dead ends and know that that's part of it. I was extraordinarily lucky to have all this time, 10 months, to work on a project, and I hope other reporters at other newspapers get the same chance. And second is that this work really can make a difference. We're not writing into a vacuum. After the second story was published, so before the third one even came out, Governor Christie immediately issued an order for his corrections commissioner to personally inspect every halfway house in the state. The legislature held 2 days of hearings, calling dozens of witnesses to testify. They've introduced 14 reform bills so far to try and change the system. But just as important, halfway houses became part of the political conversation in New Jersey. Editorial writers write about the issue now. State House reporters include halfway house conditions as part of their beat. Elected officials have had to learn about the system that they've been funding all along. And the final lesson, which I found very heartening, was that investigative reporting is just reporting. There's no secret handshake, there's no magic to it. It's the same thing all reporters do. You ask questions, you follow your curiosity, you make no assumptions, you read every page, you just keep doing it for longer. But it's the same skills that you learn doing any kind of beat reporting. I found that very, very heartening. The final break in my reporting that I want to talk about regards a man named Derek West Harris. He was a Newark barber. He had 4 kids. He was a deeply religious man whose main passion in life was cars. He could talk about cars all day, and he did. He was quite the raconteur, known around the barbershop as the guy to see if you've got a free afternoon. He was arrested for unpaid parking tickets and sent to Delaney Hall in Newark. Delaney Hall is the biggest halfway house in New Jersey. It has 1,100 beds. It houses people who are held on minor violations like traffic tickets, as well as people awaiting trial for armed robbery, scores of other violent crimes. He was sharing a cell with people who ran the gamut from minor to major. He'd been there only a few days when he was robbed of the $3 that he had in his pocket. He was murdered in the process, his body left on the floor of his cell. His killers were prosecuted, but no one ever asked whether Delaney Hall had done anything to prevent this from happening, or to make sure that this would never happen again. I pulled the trial transcript of the man who was charged with strangling him. And here, under oath, were workers describing the conditions at night, gang members declaring that they were in charge of the facility, and the names of all the inmates. I called each of them and found many of them. Most importantly, a young man named Phil Anise. And if I can get this working, I want to show you a quick video that we made about Phil. Thanks.
February 17, 2009, last Friday, went down. There was blood everywhere.
Phil and Niece served several months in a privately run New Jersey halfway house after getting caught driving drunk. A carpenter by trade, Niece kept a journal during his incarceration to, as he put it, keep himself sane.
This dude was laying in his own blood on the floor of the bathroom. I heard he got jumped by 5 guys.
The halfway house, Delaney Hall, is supposed to rehabilitate and treat inmates charged with low-level crimes in a setting that allows them far more freedom than prison. But a New York Times investigation reveals that Delaney Hall routinely houses serious criminals. This is Sam Dolnick for the New York Times. Our 10-month investigation reveals that much of Delaney Hall's staff is poorly trained, often making little more than minimum wage. Gangs roam the facility after dark.
Tuesday, April 20, 2009. This place is starting to suck.
Ibn Goodman, a gang member charged with drug possession, became Anis's roommate in the middle of his sentence. Goodman was known for robbing other inmates. Anis watched him making a jailhouse weapon called a shank.
So I had to sleep with one eye open. I mean, are you kidding me?
A few weeks later, Derek West Harris arrived. A father of 4, he prized this photo taken with Newark's mayor, Cory Booker. Harris was serving time in Delaney Hall because he had been caught driving without registration or insurance and owed $700 in traffic tickets. 2 days later, Harris was dead.
You know, it was a barber, he told me, he goes, you come down to Newark, I'll get your hair done. I'm like, I'll try it out. You know, he's like, oh, we can hang out. I mean, I can go out and have a beer. I'm like, yeah. He said, well, you'll be out this week, I'll be out in the summertime.
Goodman thought Harris was carrying cash. In the middle of the night, Goodman and 2 fellow gang members attacked Harris.
And I was sleeping for an hour when I woke up and I saw punching Derek in the stomach and Callie choking the life out of him. When I realized what was going on, and I got up and ran out of my room. By then, we were all awake and Jay turned up the lights on. And we were all in shock. What we saw was Derek on the floor, bleeding from his left nostril, fist clenched in a box stance, mouth wide open and eyes. Only the glance you can notice when a man is dead.
Harris had $3 in his pocket.
You know, he sat there, stiff as a board, not even moving. All for like a few measly bucks.
The inmates who strangled Harris were prosecuted, but New Jersey officials took no action against Delaney Hall, nor did they examine what the Newark barber was doing housed with violent criminals in the first place. In an off-camera interview, an executive for Community Education Centers, the company that runs Delaney Hall, said that state and county officials closely monitor the halfway house, and the murder was an isolated incident.
When you consider the infrequency of something like that, as tragic and unfortunate as it is, it's not representative of the nature of activity in that facility.
Anis finished up his sentence and went home a few weeks after the murder.
So here's the final conclusion of my days at end, and what I had witnessed. This place is for no man, and it gets harder and harder.
Introducing the Acura RLX.
Just show this other one. So that video was made by Rob Harris, a very talented videographer. So this project has my name on it. I was the reporter on it, but there were a team of people who worked on it. You saw in the video were some crime scene photos from the cell where Mr. Harris was killed. That took months of legal arguments. The New York Times' lawyer had to battle literally over months with Essex County officials to get them to release those. I wouldn't have been able to do that. That was the lawyer. This photo is from a halfway house, Bo Robinson, one of the biggest ones. My second story focused on it. It's where Vanessa Falcone was attacked. Our photographer, Rick Perry, had spent weeks staking out Bo Robinson, trying to get a photograph kind of through the fences, and he couldn't do it. So what he did was he found in Trenton a local helicopter company, and the helicopter guy was willing to take him up for 30 minutes one time. He could lean out the window with cameras and take pictures. So we got these aerial shots. This is one of them that's become kind of the poster photo. And that was completely Rick Perry's cleverness and ingenuity that made that happen. So the New York Times is an impressive institution, and you really get to see that on a project like this. So the final stage I just want to talk about was publication. 10 months of reporting, we were finally ready to go. A week or so beforehand, the Halfway House company finally agreed to sit down with me. They had refused all interviews until then. We heard the executive's voice there. After that interview, I laid out my findings for them and asked them to respond, and it was those kinds of responses. They hired an outside law firm and sent a 30-page memo outlining all of the reasons we were dead wrong and all of the legal actions they were preparing to take. The governor's office whipped into action and sent angry memos and calls to editors across the newsroom. But this is where the institutional muscles kind of kick in. The New York Times' First Amendment lawyer, David McCraw, read our 15,000 words, line by line. And he was not cowed by the Halfway House lawyers. I was very scared. But he has literally, faced the White House under national security issues. He has been in the Oval Office. He has dealt with fiercer people than the Halfway House lawyers. But he took this very seriously, and he read it line for line and gave us incredibly thoughtful edits. Scale this language down, insert extra attribution here, tweak this, change that. With his edit and all of the many layers of editing that exist at the New York Times, I felt bulletproof. We were ready to go. I could recite all 3 stories by memory by the end. I had fact-checked every sentence 100 times. My editor and I had stayed till midnight the night of the week before, but still pressing the button when it goes live is a terrifying thing. It was a Saturday afternoon when it went on the website, and immediately comments are pouring in and Twitter lit up and emails start coming, and within 30 minutes the Halfway House company was on the phone. This was, we've been battling, me and this spokesman, for 10 months over this in preparation for this moment. Now finally here's the story. And he has this kind of, not angry actually, this kind of heartsick tone. And he's on the phone and he says, Sam, sighs, there are grievous errors here. Really serious problems that need to be addressed immediately. Say, okay, geez, what do you got? First, you said Governor Christie visited these halfway houses regularly, Sam? He did not visit these halfway houses regularly. He visited them often, yes. He visited them many times, okay. But to say that he was there regularly is the grossest mischaracterization. Okay, noted. What else? What else is wrong? He says, next, you say Governor Christie appointed a halfway house executive to his special task force? It was a special committee, Sam. It was not a task force. Anything else? I think that's it, he said. So that was a good day, too. So that's enough for me. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you guys have any. Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much. You described what you heard from the facility, but I was wondering, what did you hear from the people you interviewed, the inmates or the sister of this victim?
Yeah, it was fascinating. The people that I interviewed all had their little vision. They had their corner of the world. So the detectives knew that there were a lot of fugitives coming out. And the sister knew that this sleazebag escaped. And the woman who kept the documents knew that her facility was really broken. But nobody had seen all of the other sides. So each of them kind of had this great illumination. They understood in a whole new way what had been happening rather than just their piece. It was like almost the Rashomon thing. Like now there's all these different perspectives that are coming in. From the government who didn't know what was happening and the inspections that weren't being done, to the workers who weren't trained, to the detectives, to this, So adding all of that together was, for each of them, what they remarked upon most.
Sam, I'm Maggie Mulvihill. I was one of the judges from New Jersey,
Thank
New
you.
York.
Oh.
It was such a great story. And I think one of the things that was striking about when we were judging these was that almost every other project had multiple bylines. And I mean, it stuck out that you were the sole reporter. So I wondered, I'm just curious if, as the project grew, if there was any discussion about bringing others in. I mean, how were you able to stand alone on this?
Yeah, I would have welcomed many, many others at times. The project kind of evolved. At the beginning, we didn't quite know what this would be. I had gotten this story from my beat reporting, so it was natural for me to dig in. And then pretty soon, once we realized that this was worth exploring, I had known the lay of the land, and then I had a contact here and there, and it just kind of builds. And I had, I think other reporters would have been great, and usually you're right, absolutely, there is a team. But here, I had this editor who was an incredible teammate and mentor, and he was able to provide a backstop for me, kind of help guide me through this all. So yeah, it was unusual in the newsroom, and it wasn't by grand design. It just kind of evolved that way. And when we realized what we had, I was already off and running, and bringing somebody else in and bringing them up to speed. We just didn't feel like we needed to do it.
Hi, Sam. Laura Weitzman, you was the Associated Press and a judge and a Nieman Fellow. It was a great story, obviously, and I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about what this editor brought, especially given that he had worked on something a little bit similar in his past, and what kinds of advice did he give you?
Yeah, Cliff was crucial. I mean, psychologically was a big part. This kind of story is crushing. For a daily reporter, your currency is your last story. So when you're out of the paper for a week, it feels kind of weird, and 2 weeks, and then a month, people are like, what's wrong with you? And it goes, it snowballs, by the 6 months. So that's a really hard feeling, especially for, a young reporter at the Times trying to make his mark. And so one of the crucial things Cliff provided for me was that kind of sort of like, no, this is right, this is okay, it's going to take this long. Don't get sidetracked and write some feature story. Don't stick your hand up for the political campaign. Stay focused on that. So that was, absolutely crucial. And then there was more practical things. We had this ton of information. What do you do with it? So he helped us map it out. 3 stories, let's do. Each one should have a separate theme. What are the themes? Well, let's lay it out. That kind of sounding board was crucial. And then the enthusiasm, when after, slogging through for months and months, you finally get those documents, you want someone who's going to be as excited as you are. What could be more deflating than coming back and saying, I got him. And he's like, yeah, I'm on the phone. I'll see you later. And he absolutely has that fire and knew how hard won that was. So that was among the most crucial things. Yeah.
Sam, I wanted to ask you about what you didn't get your hands on. When you look back at this brilliant piece of work, are there things, if you had them back, or if you had the time, or if you found the record, is there a story you weren't able to tell or write?
Yeah, there was one former corrections official who we quoted in the story. He was the only one by name who spoke to this, but there were several others that we couldn't get on the record. But he talked about filing reports about dysfunction, contraband, and that his superiors told him not to stop, that there was actually, official pressure from up above to go easy on the halfway houses. We got an element of that, but I would love to know where that pressure came from and how high up it went and how that was exercised and what happened as a consequence of that. We know that the corrections department was doing very lax investigations. Our report and various other state reports subsequently have shown that, but to try and get inside of why and how that pattern developed, I think, was for me the crucial thing.
Thanks for being here tonight, Sam. Thanks for a phenomenal presentation about a story we already love. So, I'm Betsy O'Donovan, and I was curious about your move over to the sports side.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit about the NCAA and things that need investigation there, but I'm curious what you're hoping to do on that desk and how you can carry your investigative work in that direction. It's really an interesting move.
No, it's a great question. The sports world is, completely fascinating to me. It's humongous money and gigantic personalities and very little oversight. It's the same kind of ingredients that any great story has. So there's lots of targets there for investigative work. And the sports desk at the Times has actually become one of the most innovative desks in a lot of ways. They did an amazing project last year called Snowfall about an avalanche with all this crazy multimedia. I'm sure you guys have seen it. The year before, they did a 3-part series about a hockey player who died and was abusing drugs, and the team doctors along the way who kind of helped him in this downward spiral. The year before that, they did concussions in football, which set the national agenda as among the most important sports stories in a generation. So the sports desk is already, moved far beyond last night's Knicks game, though they do cover that too. So being a part of that kind of work and helping push that forward sounded really exciting to me. There's lots of targets out there. The NCAA as an institution is in big trouble. The NFL, and it has health problems and lawsuits. So I'm hoping to do lots of that kind of investigative work, and we've got some really phenomenal reporters who are already digging in. And then there's, just great stories to be told in whatever format, like Snowfall show. There's lots of new innovation to do, and I think we're going to do a lot of it. Jen? Hi.
This is a related question, because aside from going to the sports desk, you've also gone from reporter to editor.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that and, how that's going, and also whether you ever see yourself going back to reporting? Because to me, you see a story like this, and I'm the first person to back up amazing editors, but I also think it seems like almost a huge loss that you're not doing the reporting.
I do hope to go back, and from the Times, it is no longer a one-way bridge. People do go back and forth. This, to me, was a very cool job a chance to work with really great reporters and a new sports editor who's incredibly ambitious. So that was very exciting. And I don't know if I would have taken just any editing job. But I really like the idea, as I keep saying, my editor was so important on this project. And so I like the idea of taking some of what I've learned from that way and kind of bringing it on. But also, this project, as I said, I've thought about almost nothing else. Heidi can attest, other than halfway houses, for 2 years. So I was really eager to just kind of remind myself that it's a really big world again. So the idea of going back onto another project and into another hole just sounded, I hope to do it again for sure, and I will. But right away, it sounded too narrow. So as an editor, I've got 9 projects going right now, and I get to dip into all of them. And so that, after a narrow focus like this, that kind of breadth is like fresh air and really exciting.
Hi, hello, I am Paula Molina, an event fellow from Chile. And this is another question about the sports journalism, which I think is fascinating. And I would like to know if you're interested in also addressing sports issues from a global perspective, because something that is very interesting to me is how you have a lot of money, like in FIFA, and the Football Association. And I think it's been a long, long time and no one has ever investigated that issue. So would you be interested, considering the global approach of the New York Times?
I hope the New York Times authorities are listening to you. Our number one priority is expanding internationally, and we are working like crazy to place our first sports foreign correspondents overseas, where they'll be looking at FIFA. It sounds like a great story, and soccer match fixing, and the last bullfighter in Spain. I mean, there could be a million stories, and we're very much, that is the single top goal, is to expand into international coverage, and we have to. I mean, without a question, and I think we will. Thanks.
Hi, Laura Amico. I'm a Nieman Fellow and founder of Homicide Watch DC. I'd love to know if you think of this as a local story or something else, and if it is local, who the audience is.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's both. I mean, it is a New Jersey story. We stuck to New Jersey halfway houses for these three stories. And so the audience was certainly the metro area. But halfway house, this is a national trend. States across the country are looking to cut costs more than ever. Corrections is among the biggest costs, always. So these halfway houses are becoming more and more popular. This company in particular is a national company with some of their biggest facilities in states like Alabama, Colorado. So in that sense, it's a national story. These were the three stories that were about New Jersey. We ended up doing, 8 or 9 stories maybe, partly to show that it was not just New Jersey. So we looked at the federal halfway house program. The federal government sends its prisoners to halfway houses as well. And as you probably would guess, they're just as bad. We focused in on a halfway house in Brooklyn that, same idea here. So it is both a local and a national story for us. And who the audience is, I certainly hope that it would be not just New Jersey residents. I think it might hit home especially hard when you know the towns where these people live, where they're escaping to. But I definitely hoped that these issues, both from the government side and the human side, would resonate beyond that. Arthur?
Arthur Golden, I'm your uncle.
Indeed.
I hope it's all right that I'm asking a question, because I'm an outsider here, including an outsider to journalism, and I was intrigued when you talked about the 8 months out of the newsroom, off the front page, out of the paper entirely, and the sense of how much help Cliff Levy's support had been to you. And it makes me wonder about the balance of collegiality and competitiveness in the newsroom, and how it sort of helps your work and hinders it. And I wonder if you can speak to your own experiences about that.
Yeah, the newsrooms, I think, are always competitive places. The Times certainly is. There is definitely camaraderie in that, and I've got very good friends in there, and we are all genuinely rooting for each other. But there is competition. There's only 6 stories that are going to make the front page every day, and that's the yardstick that people measure one another by. But for me, I felt like doing this project, it was kind of a different thing. It kind of took me out of that. I was like this lumbering dinosaur in the newsroom, walking slow motion while everybody's scurrying around writing stories every day and breaking news. So it wasn't quite that wasn't as much of an issue, I don't think, but it could have been, sure. Yeah. Okay, great, thank you guys.
Thank you.
This was really fun.
I just want to thank Sam for that very, very inspirational description of the work, the value of the work. Clara turned to me at one point and said it's absolutely spellbinding, and it was. It was a story unto itself, the story of the story. The work is really hard to do, and I hope that the already really excellent journalists in this room leave, if they leave with one thing. It's the story of your phone call to Vanessa, and to think about all the tens and hundreds and thousands of Vanessas that there are out there waiting for a reporter to call and to hear their story and to tell their story. I won't forget that. And again, to thank Clara and the Bingham family. I think tonight just exemplifies how important this award is, how meaningful, rewarding this work is, and how grateful we are for the opportunity to play a role in bringing that work to a larger audience. So thank you, Clara, thank you, Sam, and thank you all for being here tonight.